So I'm going to try to be brief because what I'm going to be talking about is the phase one of the project, which was the first 3 years, where we were really identifying what the key issues are and doing some initial learnings from our case studies. You can see the research team, just a great group to work with. I'm feeling nostalgic seeing people's faces for that work. Those are the researchers on the screen, and then 12 partners in the community, practitioners, government officials, private sector, NGOs, and so on. We looked at all 172 or so municipalities in the province and ended up identifying 11 case studies which were intended to represent good practice in the sense that they were actively engaged in climate change issues. The context, of course, of this was what had happened between 2008 and 2010 in BC, where a whole bunch of climate action was introduced. Our interest was finding out what that meant at the municipal level and at the community level. So we ended up identifying these 11 that you can see on the left of the screen. It was 8 municipalities, 1 First Nation community, 1 neighborhood, and 1 regional grouping. And so that was the basis of the work. We went out and did quite a bit of work on looking at what was going on in these communities, including, of course, interviews and so on. So I won't go through the methods, but I'll jump fairly quickly to the results. So we have 3 general findings. We discovered 6 drivers of innovation, 4 barriers that kept coming up, 5 success factors, and at the end we prepared an action agenda, which I'm not going to talk too much about. But I will go through the other aspects. The general findings were, in some sense, confirmation of what we had thought, but with a few interesting twists. We found that the existence of a strong provincial set of climate change actions, the charter, the tax, and on and on and on, were important in a couple of different ways. In a number of communities that were already acting quite strongly on climate change, the importance of the provincial action and context and framework and requirements was to leverage existing activities. So it actually gave further support. It allowed sort of a second wind, in a way, to be taken by communities that were already pretty active. And this is actually part of a larger issue about alignment that I'll come back to. And a number of other communities where there had not been significant climate action, the provincial policy framework became the basis for beginning, for starting activity. So it was often cited in our interviews and discussions as an important instigator of action for a bunch of reasons that maybe I'll come back to. We also found, and this is not surprising either, although it wasn't something we were particularly anticipating, is that the reporting requirements associated with the provincial policy framework were starting to make their way into the decision-making processes inside the city. And so it was a confirmation of the well-known adage, you manage what you measure. And so these reporting requirements turned out to be actually pretty important. What we found is a majority, I think it was 6 of the 11 case studies, framed their climate change policies in a larger sustainability framework. This was really interesting to us for reasons I'll come back to, having to do with a hypothesis about the issue of development paths and the need to change these underlying drivers of development. So that was an interesting finding. And we also saw evidence of what has been talked about a lot in the literature, which is this expansion of governance beyond government to include a kind of multi-stakeholder kind of governance process through participatory processes and various forms of community engagement. So those were the kind of general findings. All of this provided some empirical support for this argument that we were interested in exploring, which was whether embedding climate change in a larger framework, like sustainability, might be a fruitful way to get at some of the deeper lying questions of change. The drivers of innovation that emerged from all of these case studies were this idea of multi-level leadership. It isn't all coming from one place. For example, in a municipality, it's not all coming from the city. There's leadership being exhibited out in the NGO community and possibly in the private sector and a lot of other organizations. So there was a kind of shifting pattern of leadership at different times and places. The external funding opportunities that existed in those days were quite important. The Climate Action Revenue Incentive Program was a pretty crucial source of revenue. Federation of Canadian Municipalities had incentive programs. A Green Municipal Fund was one of them. BC Hydro offered various kinds of incentives and so on. This is basically just the principle that you have to make hay while the sun shines when I look at that list and think what has happened to some of these programs since. Making use of these opportunities and the various partners, Fraser Basin Council, BC Hydro, and so on, actually played very important roles. This whole kind of kaleidoscope of organizations that are out there with sustainability or climate change agendas become really important parts of the mix, creating those alliances, working together. Mainstreaming climate policies, that related to the question of sustainability, was that a way to mainstream them by thinking of them as kind of development policies about urban development? The existence of cost-effective alternatives, it would really help the case in certain of the case studies, help the case for climate action to be able to mount a business case for alternative energy, say district energy systems. I've already mentioned baseline inventories become crucial because they start to become a way of measuring progress. And in a couple of cases, but not all, extreme events actually had a noticeable impact on the desire of, say, the municipal government to take action. The barriers, not surprising, I think lack of funding, although this was an interesting one because what some earlier work had shown is that when council wants to do something, suddenly the budget constraints somewhat dissolve. So it's not necessarily a global lack of funding, it's about where the funding priorities are. And if they're not aligned with climate action, then that's clearly a barrier to taking more action. Electoral cycle swings, we saw even in the short 3-year period we're talking about, we had leader communities become not leader communities because of changes in council or the results of a municipal election, so on. So again, make hay while the sun shines is a crucial issue. In Ontario, for example, we used to have all 3 levels of government in this city deeply supportive. We've now lost the middle layer. And so the interesting thing in BC at the time was the alignment was provincial to municipal. There wasn't a very helpful or a positive federal presence in this arena, but making use of that alignment when it exists. Human resource constraints are huge, especially in smaller communities. You don't have a big staff, you can't do a ton of research, you're limited just because of the bandwidth of the number of people involved. And leadership, when we saw leadership change away from a strong climate action focus, we saw significant effects. Success factors, again, talked about alignment up and down the governance ladder, but there's also a crucial issue of alignment between staff and politicians. I've seen certainly here in Toronto and in Vancouver in particular, this very interesting interplay. It's when council really wants to move and staff is waiting there to act, you can really get some strong activity going. But in other times, staff has to hunker down and just survive the winds of change, keep the climate action in the back pocket and wait for opportunities to take action, changes in the larger context. Having systematic frameworks, having formalized some way of measuring and accounting and developing policy turned out to be quite important. It was cited by a number of people as a really important success factor. Fitting into these larger sustainability agendas, official community plans, integrated community sustainability plans, and so on, those provided a kind of institutional shelter for climate action that could be quite important, especially in the case of staff trying to keep alive some vestige of climate action. Partnerships, I've already talked about, comes through over and over again how important they are, and I also mentioned the funding solutions, creating ways to fund, innovative ways like revolving funds to fund climate action. So those are the main findings. I'm not going to go through the action agenda. It's quite long, and I find it a bit depressing to look at, considering how little of it has actually been adopted, because a lot of it was directed to the provincial level, and of course things have changed there. But what emerged out of this first phase of the project was a kind of support or encouragement for the idea that we really wanted to look at this question of transformative development path change, which is consistent with the way Anne led off today, her citing of the IPCC recent report. How do we change at a fundamental level the whole direction in which a community is moving, so that climate action becomes part of just the norm, the default path, instead of something that has to be torqued on to a pathway that's actually moving in a slightly different direction? That became a crucial question for phase 2.